Thank you, and it's a real privilege to be invited back to MacGill. Joe, thank you very much for the invitation. And it's also a privilege to be chairing AIB at this time. It's now restored to full financial health, and it's making a powerful contribution to the current economic vitality of Ireland. I think it just goes to prove that there is some usefulness coming out of Dublin 4. The panel has been asked to discuss the question, what does the future hold for relationships between these islands? Well, to start with, the two main countries of these Atlantic Isles have very differing strategies. One is growing fast, one is not. One has a balanced budget, one does not. One is a committed part of the largest free trade area in the world, one wants out. One wants an open border, the other seemingly doesn't understand what an international border is. But first, we need to look at some of the challenges that surround these islands and how they will impact those relationships. The post-Second World War global order is breaking down. In the 1940s, the great new multilateral organizations were all headquartered in the USA, representing America's world leadership. But under Trump, America is no longer willing to shoulder the burden of leadership and is adopting an American first posture inconsistent with multilateralism. He describes the EU as a foe. He loves Brexit, he praises Boris Johnson, and abuses Angela Merkel. The diplomatic void being created by the USA provides a huge opportunity for China. They've established their own version of the World Bank. Their diplomats have established a very strong following in Asia and Africa. They're constructing overland routes to Europe. Their military have secured naval bases around the globe. Military airfields are springing up on ocean atolls, and their technology is embedded in most of the world's communication systems. Within 2 decades, China will be the world's leading economic and military power. And that changes everything we've understood for the last 70 years. The European Union will perhaps be the second power, and America third. Family connections will always link Ireland with America, but we should prepare for the EU and the USA to be competitors, not allies. And in that spectrum, Ireland may well be on one side and a post-Brexit United Kingdom on the other. And then we must face up to the impact of new technologies. Artificial intelligence, robotics, and 3D printing will all transform the world of work. These technologies provide the opportunity for low-cost manufacturing to be re-established in Europe, but excess labor resources will be created. And I cannot predict what the world of work will look like in 10 years' time, because it will be so very different to today and a challenge for society to adapt to. The rise of China and the commonplace of robotics are the challenges of the next decade, and that will reshape these islands and potentially the relations between these countries as they adapt to the new environment in diverse ways. But closer to home and in near time, obviously Brexit will redefine the relationship between the nations of these Atlantic Isles. And there are those in the British Parliament who desire the hard Brexit approach with a complete and total severing of the relationship with the EU. They describe the EU as a prison and a protection racket. They don't want any jurisdiction of the European Court, no leaving payments, and no hard border with Ireland. If Ireland erected a border, then that would be its decision, they say. They claim that Britain is a global trading power which must break free from Europe to trade with the faster growing countries outside. Quite how Germany currently outsells Britain 5-1 in China is glossed over. Of course, Britain was a global trading power in the days of empire. Britain's military would turn up somewhere, indispose the king, find a compliant relative to sign a trade treaty, pass over some gold, and send his sons to learn cricket at Eton. I think we need to learn some new skills, don't you? Are they really queuing up to sign trade deals with the UK? Britain joined the European community to fill the void left by the end of the imperial trade. At that time, France and Germany were prospering and outgrowing the UK, and the European community represented a huge opportunity for the UK to join a higher growth club and replace the trade loss when the colonies were granted independence. And then the Brexiteers claim that British people are just different from other Europeans, ignoring that most of us come from an area centred on Schleswig-Holstein in the first place. Ignoring that the royal family who have served the country so wonderfully are Saxe-Coburg-Gotha-Battenbergs, and even the currency had the shilling coin prior to 1971, are left behind from the Free Trade Hanseatic League. And the established Anglican Church follows the Lutheran tradition. Brexit is based on a series of fantasies and fallacies. And to add to the list, Britain does not have the port capacity to impose third country customs controls, nor does it have the replacement regulatory structures ready. Now, the Brexiteer response to that is they always make things more difficult than they need to be. And this clever little verbal device follows on from the referendum winning phrase, the experts are always wrong. Of course, the experts have now been proven right. The economy dropping from the fastest growing in the G7 to the slowest. Brexit has already cost 2% of GDP, and it hasn't even started yet. And the sheer stupidity in these whole shenanigans is that Britain gave notice under Article 50 without having a Brexit strategy. We were told at the time, of course, that there was a detailed strategy, but it was too secret to disclose. The secret, of course, was that there wasn't one. And instead of a strategy, we had some genius slogans. Brexit means Brexit. And the plan for, I like this one, a red, white and blue Brexit. But these are also, of course, the colours of the Russian flag. So when the British Prime Minister described a red, white and blue Brexit, she accurately described a Brexit which gave a victory to the Russians, weakening a Britain which has the largest defence budget in Europe, distracting the EU from Ukraine and just generally creating mayhem. Of course, Britain's former Foreign Secretary is of distant Russian lineage. His mother came from a Russian family and called her son Boris to boot. And he led the Brexit campaign, but probably never thought they would win, but that he would be beautifully positioned to replace Cameron in due course. There was never a plan for Brexit, only a campaign plan. So when Boris, in his resignation letter, wrote, "The Brexit dream is dying," he is for once telling the truth, because it was only ever a dream. And for those trying to sort out the ensuing mess, it's no longer a dream, just a complete nightmare. It took 11 years of negotiation to get Britain into the European community, and subsequently there have been 45 years of integration and entanglement. Who seriously thought this could all be untangled in 2 years? Now, once you could rely on the Conservatives being the party of business and Labour being the party of the workers, but that certainty has broken down, and the Labour leadership is ambiguous on the single market, which it sees in traditional Marxist terms as a scam for factory owners to acquire cheap labour abroad and undercut local workers. And this highlights that the single market was originally Margaret Thatcher's initiative. France and Germany were not initially keen on the concept, which they saw as free market principles undermining their more social market approach. And immigration and freedom of movement has always been the big problem for Conservative governments, who strangely have never sought to impose internal controls on migration, relying solely on border controls. Now, whereas France and some other European countries, particularly France with a long and porous border, has tight controls on accessing employment and benefits, in Britain, once you're in, all the doors are open to you. And instead of leaving the EU, you might have thought it simpler just to fix access to the employment, health and benefit systems. In the 2 years since the referendum, and in the absence of a strategy, Mrs May has been busy laying down her Brexit red lines. However, all red lines negotiated so far migrated from red through pale pink to green. And proclaiming as she does that no deal is better than a bad deal is just vacuous bluster, frankly. A country of 60 million isn't going to get far trying to beat up a free trade area of 450 million people. And no wonder David Davis and Barnier only spent 4 hours together during 2018, because there has been nothing to negotiate. But the British press lap it up. The Daily Express, for example, on July the 12th, this was typical. It reported Britain as stepping up plans for a no-deal Brexit, as a warning to the EU that Britain's patience is running out. Whereas, of course, the EU has been waiting very patiently for 2 years for the British to describe what they wanted, and instead they were just given red lines, slogans, and told to be creative. 2 weeks ago, the British Cabinet assembled for a murder mystery weekend at the Prime Minister's country mansion. Would it be Boris in the billiard room or Liam with a lead pipe? However, there were great linguistic breakthroughs in the government's position. The red line of no freedom of movement was upheld, but worker mobility was just fine. A customs union was verboten, sorry, German, not allowed, but a customs partnership was just fine. And so it went on, and if it wasn't so serious, this would be funny. But the white paper published on July the 12th expands on the Chequers statement and identifies the compromises. For example, page 18 states that the UK will maintain a common rule book with the EU for goods and agri-food. But then page 49 admits that this would limit the UK's ability to make changes in the light of other trade negotiations. Another example, page 92, lists some of the EU bodies and agencies the UK wants to maintain membership of, and admits that this would be subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court. The UK ends up rule-taking and ceding controls in many areas of domestic policy. No wonder Boris said it turned Britain into a colony of the European Union. There's a long way to go in the negotiations, and many areas of the white paper will be unacceptable to the EU as well as to the Conservative Party. But the closer we get to March 2019, the weaker the UK position gets. To decide on your future relationship with the EU, the first question you must decide is whether to stay in a customs union or not. Everything else flows from that key decision. 2 years after the referendum, the British government still hasn't made that decision and is split on the issue. The white paper seeks to paper over the cracks, but the cracks are deep. And where we will end up on the spectrum of a no-deal hard Brexit on one side through to a soft Brexit or no Brexit on the other side is impossible to call. However, a no-deal Brexit would be truly disastrous for the UK economy, leading to immediate shortages of basic supplies due to port congestion and regulatory voids. One newspaper has already produced an article on what foods to stockpile in advance of March 2019. And there's worse to come before the end of March. Each week will contain new dramas, and the final answer will depend on whether the true horrendous nature of the Brexit implications get absorbed by the general population, and also on whether the government survives. The British government is in a hole and they're still digging. These are really dangerous times for the British democracy. The American voters who voted for Trump have got exactly what they were promised. On the other hand, the 17 million UK voters who voted for Brexit will not get anything like what they were promised. The resulting dissatisfaction will increase the stresses on United Kingdom territorial integrity. Scottish independence demands might grow. Shetland Islanders might repeat the claim made during the previous Scottish independence referendum to rejoin Norway. After all, Bergen and Aberdeen are equidistant from Lerwick. I dare not speculate on what might happen in Northern Ireland, and a lot obviously depends on the eventual border arrangements. And English voters without a regional parliament of their own, and having objected to paying away their taxes to Brussels, might be angry when they realise that comparable sized distributions are made to the governments in Edinburgh and Belfast. Ireland should expect more migration from the UK. With a common travel area, it may well be the only place in Europe where British people will be able to live and work without a visa. And if you're a British entrepreneur seeking to access the European labour market and not able to live and work in Berlin or Paris yourself, then an Irish city becomes a very attractive base. And the migration of regulated financial services away from the city London has continued, and Dublin has won a good share of that business. And this migration will continue long after the Brexit date, as the Union develops its own financial architecture, reducing its dependence upon a non-EU country. So let me just draw us to a conclusion, because we were asked in the conference brief to bring new thinking to an uncertain environment. And I have two thoughts to contribute under that heading. The reasons for Brexit, I hope I've described, are complete fallacies and the negative implications worse than anticipated. And those who voted for it are not going to get what they were promised. And therefore, my first suggestion is that Brexit must be reassessed by British voters. When you see a cliff precipice ahead, it would be my recommendation to press the brake pedal, not the accelerator. And my second thought goes back to the red, white, and blue Brexit, because they are not just the colours of the British and Russian flags, but also of the French tricolour. Stage left, the French tricolour. Honour to His Excellency. Now, if the British public could be shown that the French were secretly delighted by Brexit, that France would become the main military and diplomatic power and steal all of Britain's best industries, then there would be immediate, huge public opposition to Brexit. But that will be exactly the outcome. Ladies and gentlemen, please tell your British friends that the French are delighted by Brexit and indeed planning a red, white and blue one. Allez les Bleus!